Story 2 Part 1. The morning frost clung to the window panes like delicate lace, but Elena barely noticed its beauty as she pressed her face against the cold glass. Her breath fogged the surface as she watched her parents in heated discussion with a man she didn't recognize. A portly gentleman in a fine wool coat whose presence seemed to fill their modest kitchen with an uncomfortable tension. At 17, Elena had learned to read the subtle signs of her family's distress. The way her mother's shoulders curved inward when worry consumed her. How her father's weathered hands trembled slightly when he was afraid. The conversation had been going on for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling in waves that crashed against Elena's consciousness without revealing their meaning. She could catch fragments through the thin walls of their cramped home, words like arrangement, suitable family, and no other choice. Each phrase sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the December air seeping through the poorly sealed windows. When the stranger finally departed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and something that smelled like leather and money, Elena's parents called her into the kitchen. Her mother, Maria, couldn't meet her eyes, instead focusing intently on her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her father, Carlos, cleared his throat several times before finding his voice. "Elena, mija," he began, using the endearment that had always made her feel cherished, though now it sounded hollow and strange. "We need to talk to you about something important." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer as Elena took her usual seat at the scarred wooden table where she had eaten countless meals, done homework, and listened to her parents' dreams of a better life. Those dreams, she was about to learn, would not include her. "You know how difficult things have been," her mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The drought has been terrible, and the crops, they failed again this year. Your father's back injury means he can't work the mines anymore, and my sewing brings in so little." Elena nodded, though she didn't understand where this conversation was leading. She had been aware of their financial struggles. It was impossible not to be when dinner often consisted of little more than beans and tortillas, when her clothes were patched and repatched until they were more thread than original fabric. "The Hendersons," her father continued, referring to the wealthy family who owned much of the land in their small town. "They've been looking for a young woman to help in their household, someone to assist with cooking, cleaning, caring for their children. It's a good position, Elena. They would provide room and board and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "They've offered to pay us a sum up front." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Pay you? But I could work for them and send money home myself, couldn't I?" Her parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes. A communication born of 20 years of marriage and shared hardship. It was her mother who finally found the courage to speak the truth. "They want to arrange a marriage for you, Elena, to their nephew, Thomas Henderson. He's a good man, they say. Established. He has a large farm in the next county, and he's been looking for a wife, someone young and able to give him children." The kitchen tilted slightly, as if the earth had shifted beneath their small home. Elena gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "Marriage? But I'm only 17. I don't even know this man." "You would learn to know him," her father said quickly, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "The Hendersons speak very highly of him. He's 32, never been married, focused on building his property. He would take good care of you. And the money they're offering," her mother added, tears now openly flowing down her cheeks, "it would allow us to keep the house, to survive the winter, maybe even to plant again in the spring." Elena stared at her parents, these two people who had raised her with love and tenderness, who had sung her lullabies and bandaged her scraped knees, who had taught her to read using an old Bible and to sew by lamplight. Now they sat before her like strangers, asking her to sacrifice her freedom so they could survive another season. "What if—" Elena's voice cracked, and she had to start again. "What if I can't have children? What if I'm like Aunt Rosa, who tried for years, but never—" Her mother's sob cut through the question. This was the fear that haunted every young woman in their community. The possibility of infertility in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children. Aunt Rosa had been cast aside by 3 different husbands, each one seeking to annul their marriage when she failed to conceive. She now lived alone in a tiny shack on the outskirts of town, surviving on charity and the occasional sewing work. "You're young and healthy," her father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no reason to think, Elena, we don't have any other choice. "The man who was here today, Mr. Garrett. He's Thomas Henderson's representative. If we don't accept this arrangement, we'll lose the house within the month. Your mother and I were too old to start over somewhere else." Elena looked around the kitchen that had been the center of her world for 17 years. The chipped ceramic bowls her mother had painted with flowers when Elena was small. The wooden crucifix her father had carved during the long winter evenings when there was no other work to be done. The small window garden where her mother grew herbs that made even their meager meals taste like celebrations. "When?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Garrett will return on Friday to escort you to the Henderson estate. The wedding will take place the following week." Friday was only 3 days away. Elena felt time collapsing around her, the familiar rhythm of her days suddenly precious and finite. She thought of Sarah, her best friend, who would return from visiting her cousins to find Elena gone. She thought of the small vegetable garden she had planned to expand in the spring, of the book she was slowly reading through for the 3rd time, of the kittens that had been born in their barn just last month. "I understand," she said finally, though she understood nothing except that her childhood was over and her future belonged to a stranger. That night, Elena lay in her small bed listening to her parents' muffled voices through the thin walls. They were crying, both of them, and their grief somehow made everything worse. She might have been angry if they had been cruel or indifferent, but their obvious pain only emphasized how impossible their situation had become. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Elena's mother worked frantically to mend and clean her few dresses, tears falling onto the fabric as she sewed. Her father spent hours sitting on their small porch, staring out at the barren fields as if he could will them back to life through sheer determination. Elena moved through these final days at home like a ghost, memorizing every detail of the only life she had ever known. When Mr. Garrett arrived on Friday morning, Elena was ready. She had packed her few belongings into a small cloth bag: 3 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's rosary, the book she was reading, and a small wooden horse her father had carved for her 10th birthday. It seemed impossible that an entire life could fit into something so small. The goodbye was mercifully brief. Her mother held her tightly, whispering prayers and apologies into her hair. Her father pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. His last few coins, she realized. Money they desperately needed but were giving to her anyway. The carriage ride to the Henderson estate took most of the day, and Elena spent the hours watching the familiar landscape of her childhood give way to rolling hills and prosperous farms. Mr. Garrett attempted conversation several times, but Elena's responses were monosyllabic, and eventually he gave up, allowing her to retreat into her own thoughts. The Henderson house was larger than any building Elena had ever seen, with white columns and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Servants bustled about the grounds, and Elena felt increasingly small and out of place as they approached the grand entrance. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, a tall, thin woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog Elena's shortcomings in a single glance. "So, this is the girl," she said, as if Elena weren't standing right there. "She's rather small, isn't she? I hope she's stronger than she looks." Elena was shown to a tiny room in the servants' quarters, barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto the kitchen gardens. She was given a uniform, a plain gray dress with a white apron, and informed that she would begin her duties immediately. There would be time later, Mrs. Henderson explained, to prepare for the wedding. The next week passed in a whirlwind of unfamiliar tasks and harsh corrections. Elena had worked hard at home, but the Henderson household operated with a precision and formality that was entirely foreign to her. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, polished silver until her fingers cramped, and learned to navigate the complex hierarchy of the servant staff. The other workers were kind enough, but Elena felt the weight of her unusual situation. She was neither servant nor family member, but something in between that no one quite knew how to categorize. Thomas Henderson arrived the day before the wedding. Elena watched from an upstairs window as he dismounted from his horse, a tall man with broad shoulders and a beard that was already showing threads of gray despite his relatively young age. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect, and when he looked up at the house, Elena instinctively stepped back from the window. Their introduction took place in the Hendersons' formal parlor, with Mrs. Henderson presiding over the awkward exchange like a stern governess. Thomas was polite but distant, asking Elena a few perfunctory questions about her health and her family. He seemed more interested in discussing farming techniques with his uncle than in getting to know his bride-to-be. "She seems suitable," was his only comment to Mrs. Henderson when he thought Elena was out of earshot. The words stung more than any criticism could have. The wedding ceremony was held in the small chapel on the Henderson estate, with only family members and a few neighbors in attendance. Elena wore a dress borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's daughter, a woman who had married and moved to Boston years earlier. The gown was too large and had to be hastily altered, giving Elena the appearance of a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. As she stood at the altar beside Thomas Henderson, Elena felt as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. The words of the ceremony seemed to come from very far away, and when the minister asked if she took Thomas to be her husband, her "I do" sounded strange and hollow in her own ears. Thomas kissed her briefly after they were pronounced husband and wife, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like a business transaction than a romantic moment. As they walked back down the aisle together, Elena caught sight of her reflection in one of the chapel windows and barely recognized the serious-faced young woman in the oversized wedding dress. The celebration following the ceremony was modest, a dinner for the family and a few neighbors, with Elena sitting quietly beside her new husband as conversations flowed around her. She picked at her food and smiled when spoken to, but felt like an actor playing a role she hadn't adequately rehearsed. That evening, Thomas drove Elena to his farm in a wagon loaded with her few possessions and the household items Mrs. Henderson had deemed appropriate for a new bride. The ride took several hours, and they traveled mostly in silence as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been beautiful, but only made Elena feel more melancholy. Thomas's farm was impressive. Hundreds of acres of fertile land with a large, well-built house and numerous outbuildings. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and even in the fading light, Elena could see that this was a prosperous operation. Under different circumstances, she might have been excited to be mistress of such a place. "I've prepared the spare bedroom for you," Thomas said as he helped her down from the wagon. "I thought you might prefer some time to adjust to your new situation before we become truly husband and wife." Elena was grateful for his consideration, though she understood that this reprieve was temporary. The spare bedroom was comfortable and clean, with furniture that was simple but well made. There was even a small bouquet of wildflowers on the bedside table, a gesture that surprised her with its thoughtfulness. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into the routine of life on the farm. Thomas employed several workers, but the house was Elena's responsibility. She cooked and cleaned and managed the domestic side of the operation with a competence that seemed to surprise her husband. Her mother had taught her well, and the skills that had been necessary for survival in her impoverished childhood served her well in her new role. Thomas was a considerate husband, if not an affectionate one. He treated Elena with courtesy and respect, never raising his voice or making unreasonable demands. They shared meals and discussed the daily operations of the farm, and gradually, Elena began to feel that they might build something resembling a partnership, if not a love match. But as the months passed, the question that haunted every marriage began to loom larger. When would Elena become pregnant? Thomas never asked directly, but she could see him watching her, looking for signs, counting days. The unspoken expectation hung between them like a cloud, growing heavier with each passing month. Elena began to dread the monthly confirmation that she had not conceived. Each time her body reminded her of its failure to fulfill its primary purpose, she felt the weight of disappointment, not just her own, but Thomas's, though he was too polite to express it openly. As the seasons changed, and Elena's monthly cycles continued unchanged, she noticed subtle shifts in Thomas's behavior. He became more distant, spending longer hours in the fields and less time in conversation with her. The wildflowers that had appeared regularly on her bedside table became less frequent, then stopped altogether. One evening, nearly a year into their marriage, Thomas finally broached the subject that had been haunting them both. "Elena," he said carefully, setting down his coffee cup, "I've been thinking that perhaps we should consult with Dr. Morrison in town about why you haven't conceived yet." Elena's hands trembled as she continued washing the dinner dishes. "Do you think something is wrong with me?" "I don't know, but it's been almost a year and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Elena heard the unspoken words. "And a barren wife is no wife at all?" Dr. Morrison was an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands, but his examination was thorough and embarrassing. Elena endured it in stoic silence, praying that he would find some simple explanation, some easily corrected problem that would restore her value as a wife. Instead, after what seemed like hours of poking and prodding and asking intimate questions, Dr. Morrison delivered the verdict that Elena had been dreading. "I can't find any obvious abnormalities," he told Thomas, speaking over Elena's head as if she weren't in the room. "Sometimes these things simply take time, but in my experience," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "some women are simply not blessed with the ability to bear children. It's not anyone's fault, you understand. It's simply the way God made them." The drive home from town was conducted in complete silence. Elena stared out at the passing landscape, remembering her parents' fears about her potential infertility, remembering Aunt Rosa's sad, solitary life. She had become exactly what they had all feared she might become: a barren wife, a woman who could not fulfill her most basic purpose. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Thomas did not bid her good night. He disappeared into his study with a bottle of whiskey and didn't emerge until morning, his eyes red-rimmed and his jaw set in hard lines. Over the following weeks, Thomas grew increasingly cold and distant. He spoke to Elena only when necessary, and even then his words were clipped and formal. The comfortable partnership they had been building crumbled like a house built on sand, leaving behind only the hollow shell of legal obligation. Elena threw herself into her household duties with desperate intensity, as if perfect meals and spotless floors could somehow compensate for her body's failures. She tended the vegetable garden with obsessive care, preserving and canning with a efficiency that bordered on mania. But no amount of domestic competence could erase the fundamental disappointment of her existence. The breaking point came on a cold February morning, almost exactly 2 years after their wedding. Elena was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard voices in the front parlor, Thomas and another man speaking in low, urgent tones. Something about the quality of their conversation made her move closer to the door, straining to hear. "Completely understand your situation," the stranger was saying. "A man needs heirs after all, and if the current arrangement isn't producing the desired results, she's a good woman," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "She doesn't deserve this, but I can't continue living this way knowing that my farm will die with me, that everything I've built will go to distant cousins who have never set foot on this land. The annulment process is quite straightforward in cases of proven infertility," the man continued. "The church is generally sympathetic to such situations, and I understand you've already identified a suitable replacement, the Morrison girl. She's young, from a good family, and already proven fertile." Elena's hand flew to her mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. Mary Morrison was barely 16, the youngest daughter of the doctor who had examined Elena. She was pretty and sweet, and everything that Elena was failing to be. "The timing is delicate," Thomas was saying. "I don't want to cause Elena unnecessary pain. She's been through enough." Of course. But these matters are best handled quickly, don't you think? Like removing a bandage, swift and clean." Elena crept back to the kitchen on trembling legs, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had overheard. Thomas was planning to annul their marriage, to cast her aside like a broken tool that could no longer serve its purpose. And why shouldn't he? She had failed in the one thing that mattered most. But where would she go? Her parents' situation had not improved. If anything, the last 2 years had brought more hardship to their small community. She couldn't return home as a cast-off wife. The shame would destroy what little remained of her family's standing in the community, and she had no other skills, no other options for supporting herself. That evening, Elena sat in her bedroom, soon to be her former bedroom, and tried to imagine her future. She could see herself following in Aunt Rosa's footsteps, living on the margins of society, dependent on charity and pity. The thought filled her with such despair that she seriously considered whether there might be an easier way out of her impossible situation. She was still sitting there, staring out the window at the moonlit fields, when she heard a commotion from the front yard. Voices were calling out, and there was the sound of running feet. Elena hurried downstairs to find Thomas already at the front door, speaking urgently with one of the farmhands. "Fire at the Kowalski place," the man was saying breathlessly. "It's bad, Mr. Henderson. They're asking for all the help they can get." Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "Saddle my horse," he ordered, "and wake the other men." As he prepared to leave, Thomas turned to Elena with an expression that was almost apologetic. "I'll be back when I can," he said. "Keep the doors locked." Elena nodded, watching from the window as Thomas and his men rode hard toward the distant glow that marked the fire. The Kowalski farm was several miles away, and she knew they would be gone for hours, possibly until dawn. Alone in the house that had never truly felt like home, Elena made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and certainty. She could not wait to be discarded like an unwanted possession. She would not give Thomas the satisfaction of casting her aside, of making her just another cautionary tale about women who failed to fulfill their duties. She packed quickly, taking only what she could carry in a single bag: her few personal possessions, some food from the kitchen, and the small amount of money she had managed to save from her household allowance. She left behind the wedding dress she had never worn again, the household items that had been meant to establish her as mistress of this house, all the trappings of a life that had been built on false foundations. Elena left no note. What was there to say? Thomas would understand her absence as clearly as she had understood his whispered conversation about annulment. Perhaps he would even feel relieved that she had solved his problem for him, disappearing before he had to endure the unpleasant business of formally casting her aside. As she walked away from the farm in the pre-dawn darkness, Elena felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with her terror. For the first time in 2 years, she was making a choice about her own life, even if that choice led her into complete uncertainty. She had no plan beyond getting as far away as possible before Thomas returned. The main road led to the railroad depot 2 towns over, and Elena thought that if she could reach it, she might be able to buy passage to somewhere, anywhere, that offered the possibility of starting over. The walk was longer and more difficult than she had anticipated. Elena had lived a sheltered life, first in her parents' home and then on the farm, and she was unprepared for the reality of traveling alone on foot through unfamiliar countryside. Her shoes, adequate for household tasks, were soon rubbing painful blisters. Her bag, which had seemed light when she left, grew heavier with each mile. As the sun rose, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, Elena found herself on a winding mountain road that seemed to lead nowhere. She had somehow missed the turn that would have taken her to the railroad depot, and now she was completely lost in territory she had never seen before. The landscape was beautiful but intimidating. Dense forests of pine and oak stretching as far as she could see, broken only by the narrow road and occasional clearings. Elena had never been so alone in her life, and as the full implications of her situation began to sink in, she felt panic rising in her throat. She had no money for lodging, no connections to help her find work, no skills beyond those of a farmhouse wife. She was a runaway with no destination, a woman without family or husband in a world that had little place for such creatures. As the morning wore on and her situation became increasingly desperate, Elena heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Her first instinct was to hide. What if Thomas had already discovered her absence and sent someone after her? But as the wagon came into view, she saw that it was driven by a stranger, an elderly man with a kind face who looked at her with concern rather than suspicion. "You look lost, miss," he called out, pulling his horses to a stop. "This road doesn't lead anywhere except up into the mountains. Are you sure you're heading in the right direction?" Elena approached the wagon cautiously. "I'm looking for the railroad depot," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think I may have taken a wrong turn." The old man shook his head. "Railroad depot's 20 miles back the other way, I'm afraid. You've been walking in the opposite direction." He studied her with eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "You running from something, child?" The kindness in his voice nearly broke Elena's carefully maintained composure. I need to get away from here. I need to start over somewhere else." "Well, you won't get far on foot and not in this territory. These mountains can be dangerous for someone who doesn't know them." He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "I'm heading up to the logging camps to deliver supplies. There's a settlement up there, folks who might be able to help you figure out your next step. Why don't you ride along?" Elena hesitated. She knew nothing about this man or the destination he was offering, but her alternatives were limited. She could accept his help or continue wandering lost through unfamiliar territory with no plan and dwindling resources. "Thank you," she said finally, climbing up onto the wagon seat. "I'm Elena. Name's Pete," the old man replied, clicking to his horses to get them moving again. "Been making this run up to the camps for 15 years now. It's rough country, but there are good people up there, folks who understand about starting over." As the wagon climbed higher into the mountains, Elena felt as if she were leaving not just her failed marriage but her entire former life behind. The air grew thinner and cooler, pine-scented and sharp. The road became little more than a rocky trail, winding through forests so dense that they blocked out much of the sunlight. "What kind of work is there in a logging camp?" Elena asked, trying to imagine herself in such a place. "Oh, all kinds," Pete replied. "Cooking for the crews, mending clothes, tending to the injured. And there are some families up there, not just single men, women with children who need help sometimes. It's not easy living, but it's honest work, and folks tend to mind their own business about where you came from. The idea of work that was valued for its own sake, rather than as a stepping stone to motherhood, was almost foreign to Elena. But it also offered a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was a place in the world for a woman like her, a place where her worth wasn't measured solely by her ability to bear children. They rode for hours through increasingly wild terrain. Elena saw deer grazing in meadows, hawks circling overhead, and streams that tumbled down rocky slopes with a music all their own. It was beautiful but also intimidating, a landscape that could be either nurturing or deadly, depending on how well one understood its ways. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, Elena heard a new sound, the rhythmic thud of axes biting into wood, the crack and crash of falling trees. They were approaching the logging camp, and Elena felt her nervousness return. What kind of reception would she receive? What would these mountain people make of a runaway farm wife with no practical skills for their harsh environment? The camp, when it came into view, was larger and more organized than Elena had expected. There were several substantial buildings, bunkhouses for the workers, a large dining hall, various workshops and storage facilities. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Elena could see people moving about their daily tasks with the purposeful efficiency of a well-functioning community. Pete drove directly to what appeared to be the main building, a long structure with a covered porch where several men were gathered. They looked up with interest as the wagon approached, their eyes settling on Elena with curious but not unfriendly expressions. "Afternoon, Pete," one of them called out. "Got our supplies?" "That I do, Jack," Pete replied, climbing down from the wagon. "And I've got a passenger who's looking for a place to stay for a while. This is Elena. She's had some hard times and needs a fresh start." Elena climbed down from the wagon, acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her farm dress and good shoes among these rough-dressed mountain men. But their expressions were more curious than hostile, and she began to hope that Pete had been right about these people understanding the need for fresh starts. "Well now," said the man Pete had called Jack, "we always have room for folks who are willing to work. What kind of skills do you have, Elena?" "I can cook and clean and sew," Elena replied, her voice sounding small in the vast mountain air. "I managed a household for 2 years. I'm not afraid of hard work." "That's good to hear. We can always use help in the kitchen, and there are families here with children who could use some assistance." Jack studied her for a moment, and Elena had the feeling he was seeing more than she had revealed. "The question is, how long are you planning to stay? This isn't the kind of place for folks who are just passing through." Elena realized she was at another crossroads, another moment that would determine the direction of her life. She could ask Pete to take her back down the mountain tomorrow, to the railroad depot and whatever uncertain future awaited her there, or she could take a chance on this rough community, on the possibility that she might find a place where her worth wasn't determined by her ability to bear children. "I'd like to stay," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stay as long as you'll let me." Jack nodded slowly. "Then we'll find you a place to sleep and some work to do. Fair warning, though, winters are hard up here, and there's no easy way down the mountain once the snows start. If you're going to be here, you're here for the long haul." "I understand," Elena said, and for the first time since leaving Thomas's farm, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. As Pete began unloading his supplies and the men gathered to help, Elena stood on the porch of what might become her new home, looking out at the vast wilderness that surrounded the camp. She was farther from civilization than she had ever been, among people she didn't know, facing a future that was completely uncertain. But she was also, for the first time in her adult life, free to determine her own worth and her own purpose. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks touched with the golden light of the setting sun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new tests of her courage and determination. But tonight, Elena allowed herself to believe that she had found something she had been searching for without even knowing it, a place where she might finally be allowed to become who she was meant to be, rather than what others expected her to be.